The summer of 1885 was when the Silver Dollar Gang first rode into legend, though nobody in Esperanza Valley knew their real names until years later. They appeared like ghosts in the desert dawn, 5 riders in black bandanas who could shoot the buttons off a man's vest at 50 yards and disappear into the messes like smoke on the wind. Their first job was the morning express from Santa Fe, carrying the monthly payroll for the Territorial and Pacific Railroad. The train was chugging through Devil's Canyon when a rock slide, perfectly placed and expertly timed, brought it to a grinding halt. Before the engineer could even blow his whistle, the 5 riders materialized from behind the boulders. "Good morning, gentlemen," called out their leader, a tall figure whose voice carried the cultured accent of an Eastern education. "We're here for Mr. Cornelius Blackstone's money. Nothing personal, you understand, just a matter of redistribution." The railroad guards reached for their weapons, but found themselves staring down the barrels of 5 Colt .45s that had appeared faster than thought. The leader tipped his hat politely. "I wouldn't recommend it, friends. We're not here to hurt anyone, just to collect what's owed to the people of this territory." 20 minutes later, the Silver Dollar Gang rode away with $50,000 in railroad payroll, leaving behind a calling card that would become their trademark. A silver dollar nailed to the side of the express car, with a note that read, "Compliments of the Silver Dollar Gang, Justice rides again." Sheriff Miguel Santos arrived at the scene 2 hours later, his weathered face grim as he examined the evidence. At 45, Miguel had been keeping the peace in New Mexico territory for over 20 years. And he'd never seen a robbery executed with such precision and courtesy. "Nobody hurt?" he asked the train conductor, a nervous man named Perkins who kept mopping his brow with a handkerchief. "Not a scratch, Sheriff." They were polite as Sunday school teachers, even helped Mrs. Patterson down from the passenger car when she felt faint. "But they cleaned out that strongbox slick as you please." Miguel studied the silver dollar nailed to the train car. It was genuine silver, worth more than most folks in the territory saw in a month. What kind of outlaws left money behind as calling cards? Any idea which way they went? Perkins pointed toward the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. "Headed north, but Sheriff, those horses they were riding? I've been working trains for 15 years, and I ain't never seen animals move like that. Like they were flying instead of running." Miguel mounted his horse, a sturdy paint named Esperanza after the valley they called home. He'd been tracking outlaws since before statehood, and he knew that every gang had a pattern, a weakness that would eventually bring them down. The Silver Dollar Gang might be clever, but nobody stayed ahead of the law forever. What Miguel didn't know was that 50 miles north in the struggling farming community of Agua Dulce, the Silver Dollar Gang was already at work. The drought had been brutal that summer, turning the Rio Grande into a muddy trickle and leaving the farmers' fields cracked and barren. Worse yet, the Territorial and Pacific Railroad had been buying up water rights and charging outrageous prices for irrigation, forcing families who'd worked the land for generations to choose between their crops and their children's future. Maria Esperanza Valdez was hanging laundry behind her adobe house when she heard the sound of approaching horses. At 28, she was a widow with 3 young children, trying to keep her small farm alive on determination and prayer. The sight of 5 masked riders would have terrified most women, but Maria had faced down drought, debt, and despair. A few outlaws didn't seem so frightening by comparison. "Buenos dias, señora," called the leader, dismounting with fluid grace. Up close, Maria could see that his clothes were well made but dusty from hard riding, and his eyes above the black bandana were the color of desert sage. "We heard you folks might be having some trouble with the railroad." "Who's asking?" Maria replied, her hand resting on the handle of the hoe she'd been using in her garden. "Friends," said another rider, a woman whose voice carried the musical lilt of Ireland. "Friends who think it's a crying shame when honest people can't afford water for their crops." The leader reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of silver coins. "We'd like to make a donation to the Agua Dulce Farmers Cooperative. Anonymous, of course." Maria stared at the pouch, then at the 5 riders. "You're them, aren't you? The Silver Dollar Gang?" We're just folks who believe in lending a helping hand, the leader said gently. The railroad's been charging you 10 times what water's worth. This should be enough to dig new wells and buy seed for next season. But you're outlaws. The Irish woman laughed, a sound like silver bells in the wind. Outlaws, maybe. But we're not thieves, love. We just believe in taking from those who have too much and giving to those who don't have enough. Before Maria could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the valley. The Silver Dollar Gang was mounted and moving before the dust had settled, disappearing into the maze of arroyos and mesas that crisscrossed the landscape. Sheriff Santos arrived 5 minutes later, his paint horse lathered with sweat from the hard ride. He found Maria still standing in her yard, staring at the leather pouch in her hands. "Senora Valdez," Miguel said, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. "I'm tracking some outlaws who robbed the morning train. You see anyone suspicious come through here?" Maria looked at the sheriff, a good man who'd grown up in these valleys, who understood the struggles of the farming families, and made a decision that would change everything. "No, Sheriff," she said quietly. "Haven't seen anyone all morning." Miguel's dark eyes studied her face, noting the leather pouch she held and the way her children had suddenly found urgent business inside the house. He'd known Maria since she was a girl, had attended her wedding and her husband's funeral. She wasn't a liar by nature. "Maria," he said gently, "if you know something about these outlaws—" "I know that my children will eat this winter," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "I know that we'll have water for our crops and seed for planting. Sometimes, Sheriff, that's all a person needs to know." Over the following weeks, the Silver Dollar Gang struck 3 more times. They robbed a stagecoach carrying tax money collected by corrupt territorial officials, liberated a strongbox full of fees extorted from Mexican-American landowners, and made off with a shipment of gold intended to bribe judges in land disputes. Each time, they left their silver dollar calling card, and each time the money found its way to people who needed it most: farmers facing foreclosure, families whose land had been stolen through legal trickery, communities trying to build schools and churches. The territorial governor, a pompous man named Blackstone who owned controlling interest in the railroad, put a $10,000 bounty on the gang's heads. Bounty hunters and hired guns poured into New Mexico territory, but the Silver Dollar Gang seemed to vanish into the landscape like morning mist. Sheriff Santos found himself in an impossible position. His job was to uphold the law, but the law seemed to be working against the very people he'd sworn to protect. The railroad's water monopoly was legal, but morally wrong. The tax collectors were corrupt, but officially sanctioned. The land grabbers used the courts to steal property that had been in families for generations. The breakthrough came when Miguel was investigating the gang's latest robbery, a payroll shipment bound for the railroad's construction crews. The outlaws had struck at dawn, making off with $75,000 in gold and silver. But this time, they'd left more than just their calling card. Hidden in the rocks where the gang had waited in ambush, Miguel found a piece of paper that had blown away in the wind. It was a fragment of a letter, written in an educated hand. "The people of this territory deserve better than to be robbed by men in suits and ties. If the law won't protect them, then perhaps it's time for justice to ride outside the law. The railroad's corruption runs deeper than anyone suspects, and I have proof that Governor Blackstone—" The letter broke off there, but it was enough to confirm Miguel's growing suspicions. The Silver Dollar Gang wasn't just a group of common outlaws. They were fighting a war against corruption, using the only weapons available to them. That evening, Miguel sat in his office, staring at the fragment of letter and wrestling with his conscience. Outside, the sounds of Esperanza Valley drifted through his window. Children playing, families gathering for dinner, the normal rhythms of a community that was finally beginning to thrive again, thanks to the gang's donations. A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, and was surprised to see Maria Valdez enter, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "I brought you some tamales, Sheriff," she said, setting the basket on his desk. "My grandmother's recipe." "That's very kind, Maria, but—" "There's something else," she interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. Something you need to know about the Silver Dollar Gang. Miguel leaned forward, his heart racing. What is it? Maria glanced around the office, making sure they were alone. They're not what you think, Sheriff. They're not criminals. They're heroes. Maria. Listen to me, she said urgently. My husband, God rest his soul, he worked for the railroad before he died. He kept records, documents that showed how Governor Blackstone was stealing from the territorial treasury, how the railroad was bribing judges and officials. Carlos was going to expose them, but what? But he died in an accident at the rail yard before he could tell anyone. The Silver Dollar Gang, they have those documents now. They're trying to gather enough evidence to expose the whole corrupt system. Miguel felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. How do you know all this? Maria smiled sadly. Because my brother is one of them, Sheriff. Eduardo Valdez? You remember him? He went to college back east, became a lawyer. When he came home and saw what was happening to our people, he decided that sometimes justice has to work outside the courtroom. The revelation hit Miguel like a physical blow. Eduardo Valdez, the brilliant young man who'd been the pride of Esperanza Valley, who'd returned from Harvard Law School with dreams of helping his people. Miguel had wondered what had happened to him, why he'd seemingly disappeared after his return. Where is he now? Miguel asked. Close, Maria replied. Closer than you might think. Sheriff, they want to meet with you. They have a proposition. The meeting was set for midnight at the old Spanish mission ruins outside town. Miguel rode out alone, his hand resting on his gun, but his mind open to possibilities he'd never considered before. The Silver Dollar Gang was waiting for him in the moonlight, their horses tied to the crumbling walls of the ancient church. As Miguel approached, the leader stepped forward and slowly pulled down his bandana. Hello, Miguel, said Eduardo Valdez, his face older and more weathered than Miguel remembered, but his eyes still burning with the same idealistic fire. Thank you for coming. Eduardo, Miguel breathed. Maria told me, but I still can't quite believe it. Believe it, said the Irish woman, pulling down her own bandana to reveal a face marked by intelligence and determination. I'm Catherine O'Malley, formerly of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. I came west to investigate railroad corruption and ended up joining the fight. One by one, the other gang members revealed themselves. James Gentleman Jim Morrison, a former Union cavalry officer. Carlos Mendoza, a vaquero whose family had lost their ranch to legal trickery. And Sarah Running Bear, a Navajo woman whose people had been cheated out of their water rights. We're not outlaws by choice, Miguel, Eduardo said. We're outlaws by necessity. The system is so corrupt that working within it is impossible. But we're not just robbing trains for the thrill of it, we're gathering evidence, building a case that will bring down Blackstone and his whole network. What kind of evidence? Miguel asked. Catherine stepped forward, pulling a leather portfolio from her saddlebags. Forged documents, bribed officials, stolen land grants. We have enough evidence to send half the territorial government to prison. But we need someone on the inside, someone with legal authority to make arrests and file charges. You want me to join you? We want you to help us end this, Eduardo said. Not as an outlaw, but as a lawman. Help us expose the truth, and we'll surrender ourselves for trial, but only after Blackstone and his cronies are behind bars. Miguel looked around at the 5 faces in the moonlight. Good people driven to desperate measures by a corrupt system. He thought of Maria and her children, of all the families who were finally able to keep their farms and their dignity thanks to the gang's actions. What do you need me to do? He asked. The plan they hatched was audacious in its simplicity. The Silver Dollar Gang would stage one final robbery, the biggest yet, targeting a shipment of gold that Blackstone was secretly moving to Mexico to avoid territorial taxes. But this time, Sheriff Santos would be ready for them. The robbery took place at high noon on the main street of Esperanza Valley, in full view of dozens of witnesses. The Silver Dollar Gang rode in like avenging angels, their guns blazing with blanks, as they forced Sheriff Santos to open the strongbox containing Blackstone's illegal gold. But instead of riding away with the money, Eduardo Valdez stood up in his stirrups and addressed the crowd that had gathered. People of Esperanza Valley, he called out, his voice carrying across the dusty street. We are the Silver Dollar Gang, and we have something to show you. Catherine O'Malley opened the strongbox, revealing not just gold, but stacks of documents that proved Blackstone's corruption. As the crowd pressed closer, Eduardo began reading from the papers, evidence of bribery, extortion, theft, and fraud that reached all the way to the territorial capital. "This gold was stolen from your taxes," Eduardo declared. "These documents prove that Governor Blackstone has been robbing the people of New Mexico territory for years." The crowd's murmur grew to a roar of outrage as the full scope of the corruption was revealed. Sheriff Santos stepped forward, his badge glinting in the sunlight. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of New Mexico," he announced, "I hereby place Governor Cornelius Blackstone under arrest for theft, fraud, and conspiracy." The trial that followed became the most sensational legal proceeding in territorial history. The evidence gathered by the Silver Dollar Gang was overwhelming, and one by one, Blackstone's network of corrupt officials fell like dominoes. The governor himself was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, and the railroad was forced to pay massive restitution to the communities it had cheated. As for the Silver Dollar Gang, they kept their word and surrendered for trial. But the jury, composed of farmers and ranchers who had benefited from the gang's actions, deliberated for exactly 5 minutes before returning a verdict of not guilty on all charges. "Sometimes," the jury foreman explained, "justice and the law ain't the same thing. These folks were fighting for justice." Eduardo Valdez returned to practicing law, this time as a territorial prosecutor dedicated to rooting out corruption. Catherine O'Malley opened a detective agency specializing in corporate fraud. The other gang members went back to their regular lives, but they remained close friends and occasional partners in the ongoing fight for justice. Sheriff Miguel Santos was elected territorial marshal, and later became one of New Mexico's first state senators when it achieved statehood. He never forgot the lesson he learned from the Silver Dollar Gang, that sometimes the greatest service to the law is knowing when to look beyond it to find true justice. The silver dollars that the gang left as calling cards became collector's items, symbols of a time when ordinary people stood up to extraordinary corruption and won. But more than that, they became symbols of hope, proof that even in the darkest times, there are always those willing to fight for what's right. Years later, when Eduardo Valdez was an old man telling stories to his grandchildren, they would ask him about the Silver Dollar Gang and their adventures. He would smile and pull out a worn silver dollar, letting it catch the light as he spoke. "We weren't heroes," he would say. "We were just people who couldn't stand by and watch injustice triumph. The real heroes were the folks who supported us, who believed that things could be better, who were willing to take risks for their neighbors and their community." "But Abuelo," his granddaughter would ask, "weren't you scared?" Eduardo would chuckle, his eyes twinkling with the memory of moonlit rides and daring rescues. "Scared? Of course we were scared. But being scared doesn't make you a coward. It makes you human. Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right, even when you are afraid." And in the town of Esperanza Valley, where the Silver Dollar Gang first rode into legend, they still tell the story on summer evenings when the desert wind carries whispers of adventure across the mesas. They tell of 5 riders who chose justice over law, community over personal safety, and hope over despair. They tell of a time when the West was truly wild, not because of violence and lawlessness, but because it was a place where ordinary people could become extraordinary, where justice could ride on horseback, and where a silver dollar could be worth more than all the gold in the territory. For in the end, that's what the Wild West was really about. Not just the gunfights and the glory, but the belief that in a new land, under an sky skymeless, anything was possible for those brave enough to reach for it.